take the view that the triple crisis is not, the worst development that we have seen up to today. Yes, there are going to be more difficult challenges, right? This is just a sign for us to prepare for the more difficult challenges. In a sense, there is a lot of talk about capital flowing uphill, right? And I think this is sort of a natural phenomenon, right? Normally, countries that develop faster, they become the creditors of countries that develop more slowly. So it's not exactly the level of development that matters. It's not exactly the high level of development in the West that is supposed to ensure that capital flows from the West to developing countries, right? The way it was previously the case in history was that countries that developed faster, they were the creditors to all the world. So the United States were developing faster in the 20th century and they were the net creditor. And now when they develop more slowly, countries that become net creditors are the countries that develop faster, which are developing countries, right? So it's sort of a natural development, and maybe there is a better way to do it, but we haven't observed it in history so far. So it is a price that developing countries are supposed to pay for their rapid development. This is known as a Feldstein-Horioka puzzle, which says that investment rates and savings rate in countries are very much correlated. So countries that are having high savings rate, they are also having high investment rates. And you would think that a country which is poor and which is in need to mobilize the savings can mobilize savings from the rest of the world and can finance its investment by borrowing from the rest of the world. But in practice, this is not something that actually occurred. In practice, countries that had high savings rate, they were financing the development of countries that were developing more slowly with a low savings rate. No matter whether these countries were rich or poor, yes, even if the countries are poor, they were, like now China, China is poorer than, or India, which has a very high savings rate also. The savings rate in India increased dramatically, pretty much like in China in recent, say, 30 years. So those countries are financing part of the consumption in the developed world. So this trend is probably going to produce an even greater crisis, maybe in 10 to 20 years from now, as developed countries are going into debt. For developing countries, this is a price to pay for their development, and for developed countries, this is the exchange of short-term benefits for long-term losses. So developed countries will probably face a major debt crisis, right? Something like 10 to 20 years down the road. And of course, it's better to ensure that the adjustment is orderly, that this is a soft landing rather than hard landing. But the international debt of the US is currently about 30% only. Net international indebtedness of the US is currently something like 30% of GDP. And for Europe, Europe is even a net creditor, and Japan has a very large government debt, but international indebtedness of Japan is actually also positive, right? So it's not indebtedness. Japan is a net creditor to the rest of the world. So there is still some room, yes, for developing countries to enjoy this position of being the creditors to the world and to enjoy the high growth rates. But yes, in 10 to 20 years, we'll be probably coming to the point where the major adjustment is supposed to be made.